There are photographs that have never been widely published, not because they were lost, and not because they were destroyed, though many were. They were set aside because the people who reviewed them decided, in quiet meetings in offices far from any trench, that the public did not need to see what a modern industrial war actually produced in human terms. That decision was made early. It was made systematically, and it was enforced not through violence but through paperwork, through official channels, through the simple bureaucratic logic that some truths complicate the machinery of a war that still needed fighting. World War I is remembered in a particular way. You know the shape of that memory. The mud, the wire, the poppies, the poetry, Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, the Christmas truce, the lions led by donkeys. It is a memory that has been curated over more than a century, and that curation has worked so thoroughly that most people can recite the major symbols of the war without knowing almost anything about what the war actually did to the men who passed through it. The symbols exist. The experience has been largely erased. That is not accidental. The erasure was built into the war while it was still happening. When the British Expeditionary Force crossed to France in 1914, the War Office already had a system in place for controlling information. The Defence of the Realm Act, passed in August of that year, gave the government sweeping authority to censor press reports, prosecute anyone who published information deemed harmful to the war effort, and suppress material that might discourage recruitment or damage public morale. The act was broad enough to cover almost anything. It was used accordingly. Official war correspondents were not assigned to the front until 1915, and even then, they operated under conditions that made genuine reporting nearly impossible. They were not permitted to go where they wanted. They were escorted by officers whose job was to manage what they saw. Their copy was reviewed before it was transmitted. Anything that described the war in terms that might disturb a British breakfast was removed. What remained was a version of events that bore a formal relationship to the truth, while systematically omitting everything that made the truth unbearable. The first men who went to France in 1914 understood almost nothing about what they were entering. The British regular army that crossed the Channel was a professional force, experienced in colonial conflicts, trained in the tactics of mobile warfare, accustomed to fighting enemies who were outgunned and out-organized. They were not prepared for what happened to them at Mons, at Le Cateau, at the Marne, and then at Ypres, where the war stopped moving and began to sink into the ground. The trench system that emerged in the autumn of 1914 was not planned. No general on either side had intended to fight this kind of war. The trenches appeared because the alternative was to stand in the open and be shot. Both sides dug because the ground could stop bullets when flesh could not. By the end of 1914, a line of fortifications stretched from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border, roughly 450 miles, and no one on either side of that line had any clear idea how to break through it without losing more men than the objective was worth. The men who lived in those trenches lived in conditions that no official document described accurately. The British War Office issued reports about the front that referred to the trenches as positions, as sectors, as defensive works. The language was geographic and strategic. It said nothing about what those positions smelled like after 6 weeks of rain, when the drainage failed and the walls began to soften and the floor became a layer of mud that contained things that should not be in mud. It said nothing about what the men found when they tried to dig new trenches and discovered that they were digging through the remains of men who had been buried there months before. The smell of the Western Front was something that veterans mentioned more consistently than almost any other sensory detail. It was not a single smell. It was a compound of unwashed bodies, of chloride of lime used as disinfectant, of cordite and sulfur from the shelling, of rotting wood, of stagnant water, and underneath all of it, persistent and impossible to ignore, the smell of decomposition. Men who had served in the trenches for extended periods reported that they could not eat certain foods for years afterward because the smell reminded them of the front. Some reported it for the rest of their lives. This detail appears almost nowhere in the official record. The medical records are more informative, though they too were subject to censorship and suppression. The casualty statistics released during the war were not fabrications exactly, but they were arranged to minimize the appearance of loss. Totals were delayed. Categories of casualty were defined in ways that kept the numbers from looking as large as they were. Men who died in hospitals days or weeks after being wounded were sometimes recorded as sick rather than as wounded. Men who were evacuated from the front due to psychological collapse were classified according to a rotating set of diagnoses that avoided the word shell shock, when that term began to acquire too much public resonance. Shell shock is one of the strangest episodes in the medical history of the war, because it represents a case in which reality forced itself into official consciousness, and official consciousness immediately began working to manage, contain, and neutralize it. The condition appeared almost immediately once the shelling began in earnest. Men who had been exposed to prolonged artillery bombardment began exhibiting symptoms that had no simple physical explanation. They shook. They could not speak. They could not stop weeping. They could not sleep, or they could not stay awake. Or they slept but woke screaming from dreams that they often could not describe, or refused to describe. They became rigid, or they became limp. Some lost their sight, without any injury to their eyes. Some lost their hearing without any damage to their ears. Some developed paralysis in limbs that were anatomically undamaged. The army's initial response was not medical, it was disciplinary. A man who could not function was not producing military output. The question of why he could not function was secondary to the question of what was to be done with him. Many men in the early months of the war who would later have been recognized as psychiatric casualties were simply ordered to get up. When they could not get up, they were punished. When punishment failed to restore function, they were sometimes shot. The number of British soldiers executed during World War I is officially recorded at 306. That number covers a range of offenses, but the majority were executed for desertion or cowardice. Among those men, an undetermined number were exhibiting what would now be recognized as symptoms of severe post-traumatic stress disorder. They were not cowards. They were not deserters in any morally meaningful sense of the word. They were men whose nervous systems had been destroyed by sustained industrial violence, and who were then killed by their own army for failing to continue functioning. The British government refused to grant posthumous pardons to the executed men for decades after the war. A conditional pardon was finally issued in 2006. It did not include individual exoneration. It did not restore anything. It was a document, and like so many documents that came out of that war, it served administrative purposes, while the men it referred to remained where they had been left. Let us be specific about what artillery did to a human body, because the official accounts were never specific about this, and because specificity is the only antidote to the abstraction that allowed the killing to continue. The artillery of World War I was not like artillery from earlier periods of warfare. The guns of 1914 to 1918 were products of the same industrial revolution that had produced the steel mills and the railways and the factories that were running at full capacity across Europe. They were precision instruments capable of delivering enormous explosive force at distances of several miles. A single heavy shell from a German 420mm howitzer contained more explosive energy than anything that had been used in warfare before the 20th century. When it landed, it did not simply create a crater. It created a pressure wave that traveled through the earth and the air simultaneously. And that wave, meeting a human body, did things to that body that defied the conventions of how people thought about injury. Men were found after bombardments with no visible wounds. They were dead. Their internal organs had been ruptured by pressure. Their brains had been damaged by concussion without any penetrating injury to the skull. Men survived direct hits and walked away from the impact point, and then sat down and did not get up again. Men were buried alive when shells collapsed the trench walls, and many of them were not retrieved in time. And many of those who were retrieved spent the remaining months or years of their lives unable to tolerate enclosed spaces. The standard British shell at the beginning of the war was a shrapnel round designed to burst above infantry in the open. It was not designed for trench warfare. When the trenches appeared, the army needed a different kind of shell, one that could destroy fortifications and kill men sheltering in covered positions. The high-explosive shell that replaced it was far more destructive, and what it produced at the point of impact was not a wound in any recognizable sense, but a form of disintegration. Men disappeared, not in the sense of running away, in the sense of ceasing to exist as coherent physical objects. The Meningate Memorial at Ypres bears the names of 54,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who have no known grave. Many of them have no grave because there was nothing left of them large enough to bury. The memorial is a record of obliteration. The soldiers who survived alongside men who were obliterated in this way had to continue functioning. That requirement, the requirement to continue functioning in the presence of obliteration, is the central psychological fact of trench warfare, and it is one that the official record treated as a matter of morale and discipline rather than as a medical crisis. The army developed a specific vocabulary for managing this reality. Wastage was the standard military term for casualties. Men were not killed or wounded in the administrative language of the war. They were wasted. This was not slang. It was formal language used in official reports and planning documents. The rate at which units were wasted was calculated and projected and fed into the tables that determined how many reinforcements were needed and when. The human beings behind the term were present in the calculations only as units of military capacity, and once that capacity had been expended, the unit was classified as waste. Reinforcements arrived to replace the waste. Many of them were very young. The minimum enlistment age in Britain was 19, but the verification of age was perfunctory and widely understood to be so, and boys of 16 and 17 enlisted in large numbers throughout the war. There are documented cases of boys as young as 14 serving on the Western Front. The army knew this. The army continued to use them. Those boys who survived their first experience of bombardment were described in the letters of officers as having aged in a matter of hours. That phrase appears across a range of sources, from different units, different periods of the war, different nationalities. The universal quality of the observation suggests that it was describing something real, some visible transformation that came over the face of a young man during his first sustained artillery barrage. Something went out of those faces and was replaced by something that did not have a name. The officers themselves were not immune. The casualty rate among junior officers on the Western Front was disproportionately high because junior officers were expected to lead their men, which meant being visibly present at the most dangerous moments, which meant being shot first. The average life expectancy of a second lieutenant newly arrived on the Western Front in certain periods of the war is often cited as 6 weeks. This figure varies by period and theater, and some historians dispute specific numbers, but the general pattern is not disputed. Junior officers died faster than enlisted men, and they died consistently enough that the army developed an efficient system for replacing them. The efficiency of that replacement system is one of the features of the war that tends to get overlooked in favor of the more dramatic failures. The British Army was, in purely logistical terms, extraordinarily effective at keeping the machinery running. Shells arrived at the front. Food arrived, however, inadequate. Medical treatment was organized, however, insufficient. Mail was delivered with inconsistency that astonished the men who received it. The Postal Service on the Western Front operated through the entire war, processing millions of letters and parcels every week, maintaining a line of communication between the men in the trenches and the civilian population that had sent them there. That Postal Service was also a surveillance and censorship operation. Letters from soldiers were subject to censorship by their own officers. Anything that described conditions accurately, that mentioned specific locations, that could be read as undermining morale, was cut out, literally cut out, with scissors, leaving rectangular holes in the paper. Men learned quickly what they could and could not say. They developed codes. They described the weather when they meant the shelling. They said they were well when they meant they were still alive. The letters that arrived home were not lies exactly. They were translations of a reality that had no acceptable language in the civilian world. The women who received those letters and who wrote back faced their own form of censorship. Recruitment campaigns through the early years of the war explicitly recruited women as agents of pressure on reluctant men. The White Feather Campaign, in which women distributed white feathers to men not in uniform as symbols of cowardice, was not an organic social movement. It was organized. It was encouraged by figures in the government and military who understood that social shame was a mobilization tool. Women who had no knowledge of the trenches were enlisted as instruments for sending more men into them. Some of those women lost husbands, brothers, and sons to the trenches. Some of them gave white feathers to men who were on medical leave from the front, men who were walking through civilian streets on doctor's orders while carrying wounds that were invisible. There are recorded cases of men in civilian clothes being accosted in this way who had already lost limbs or who were recovering from gas attacks. The campaign continued. Gas. The word is so compact and so familiar in the context of this war that it has lost its ability to disturb. It should not have lost that ability. The first major German gas attack at Ypres in April 1915 released approximately 160 tons of chlorine. The men in the Allied trenches who saw the greenish-yellow cloud moving toward them across no man's land had no frame of reference for what they were seeing. Their officers had received reports suggesting that gas might be used. The reports had not been acted upon. There were no gas masks. There was no protocol. The men stood and watched the cloud come toward them, and then the cloud arrived. Chlorine attacks the respiratory system. It reacts with moisture in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid. Men who were fully exposed to the concentration of chlorine in that first attack drowned in their own bodies, their lungs filled with fluid. They suffocated on material produced by their own tissue in response to the chemical irritation. It took, in some cases, 48 hours to die. It was not a quick death. It was not a clean death. The medical staff who treated those men described what they saw in terms that were removed from the published accounts of the battle. The British and French response was to develop their own chemical weapons programs and deploy them against German positions. The war's first major British gas attack took place at Loos in September 1915, and it went badly because the wind shifted. The chlorine released from British cylinders blew back toward British positions. Men in British trenches were gassed by British gas. This was recorded. The official account described it as a technical setback. Phosgene arrived. Mustard gas arrived. Each new agent produced different effects. Mustard gas, introduced in 1917, did not kill quickly. It was not designed to kill quickly. It was designed to incapacitate. It caused blistering of exposed skin, severe inflammation of the eyes that could produce temporary or permanent blindness, and blistering of the respiratory tract. Men contaminated with mustard gas required prolonged medical care that removed them from the front for weeks or months. They occupied hospital beds. They required nursing. They used resources. That was the point. The gas was not a weapon of mass killing so much as a weapon of mass disablement. A calculation had been made that a disabled soldier was more costly to the enemy than a dead one. The men who survived mustard gas exposure often did not recover fully. Their eyes remained sensitive for years. Some went permanently blind. The blistering left scars. Men who had been exposed to phosgene developed pulmonary conditions that shortened their lives by decades, dying in the 1930s and 40s of lung diseases that were products of the war, but were recorded simply as respiratory failure. They did not appear in the casualty statistics of World War I. The war was over. The paperwork had moved on. The medical infrastructure of the Western Front was, by the standards of any previous war, enormous. The casualty clearing stations and base hospitals established by the British Army processed hundreds of thousands of men through the war. The Nursing Corps, the Royal Army Medical Corps, the voluntary aid detachments, all of these organizations handled a volume of injury that had never been seen before in the history of medicine. The surgeons who worked in those facilities became, of necessity, specialists in forms of trauma that had not existed before industrial warfare. Wound classification during World War I produced new categories. Gunshot wounds were familiar. Fragment wounds from shell bursts were different, producing irregular injuries with multiple entry points, carrying metal, cloth, and contaminated soil deep into tissue. The infection rate from fragment wounds was dramatically higher than from bullet wounds. Gas gangrene, caused by anaerobic bacteria present in the heavily cultivated soil of Flanders and northern France, was endemic. Men with wounds that seemed manageable developed gangrene within 24 to 48 hours and required amputation if they were lucky enough to reach a surgeon in time. The amputation numbers are difficult to obtain precisely because they were not prominently reported. A conservative estimate for British amputees from World War I is approximately 41,000. German estimates are higher. French estimates are higher. The men who returned from the war missing arms and legs were visible in the streets of every European city for the next 40 years. Their presence was a fact about the war that could not be suppressed by censorship because they were walking through public spaces. The response to their presence, in Britain and in most European countries, was to develop systems of prosthetics and rehabilitation that made them as invisible as possible. The Ministry of Pensions was established in Britain in 1916 to manage the financial aspects of military disability. Its records, when they have been made available to researchers, reveal a systematic effort to minimize pension liability by challenging the validity of disability claims, by narrowing the definitions of service-related injury, and by exploiting the inability of many damaged men to navigate bureaucratic processes effectively. Men who had been physically destroyed by the war found themselves required to prove in writing before panels of officials that their destruction was real. Some of those men could not write, some could not speak, some could not leave the house. The pension system continued to function regardless. The landscape itself was destroyed. This is something that photographs can show, and some of those photographs have been published, and they are still astonishing. The Ypres salient, after 3 years of continuous bombardment, was not recognizable as agricultural land. The shell craters overlapped one another so thoroughly that the original surface of the earth had been entirely replaced by a new geology of clay and water and metal. Trees had been reduced to stumps. Roads had been obliterated. Villages had been destroyed to the level of their foundations, and in some cases below that level. The word obliterated is not metaphorical in this context. The Somme battlefield after July 1916 was photographed from the air. The aerial photographs show a surface that looks like nothing that had been on Earth before the industrial age. 20th century military historians describe it as a moonscape, but that comparison undersells the strangeness of it because the moon was never inhabited. The Somme had been inhabited. The craters and the wire and the scattered detritus of the battle covered farms and orchards and villages and roads that had existed for centuries. The war did not just destroy the men who fought on that land, it destroyed the land. The first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916, produced British casualties of approximately 57,000 men. Of those, nearly 20,000 were killed. This happened in a single day. The attack had been planned for months. The week-long preliminary bombardment that preceded it, during which the British fired over 1.5 million shells into the German lines, was supposed to destroy the wire, the machine gun positions, and the defenders. It did not do those things adequately. The wire was cut in some places and thickened in others by shells that threw it into new configurations. The machine gun positions were constructed deep enough to survive the bombardment. The defenders were shaken but alive, and when the whistles blew and the British infantry climbed out of their trenches and began walking across no man's land, the defenders emerged from their dugouts and began firing. The mechanics of that morning have been described many times. What has not been adequately described is what it was like to be in command of a corps or a division and to receive, over the course of several hours, the mounting casualty reports from units that were being systematically destroyed. The reports came by telephone and by runner and by various signals arrangements, and they presented the same picture from multiple directions. The attack was failing. Men were dying at a rate that exceeded any reasonable calculation of acceptable loss, and the order to continue attacking was maintained. This requires explanation, and the explanation is not simple, and it does not reduce to stupidity on the part of generals, though there was stupidity. The generals who ordered those attacks were operating within a framework of military logic that made the continuation of the attack seem rational. Stopping and retreating would cost the ground that had been gained. Maintaining pressure prevented the enemy from reinforcing his position. Reserves could break through if the front-line units could advance far enough to create the opportunity. These were not irrational arguments. They were rational arguments applied to a situation in which the premises had become invalid, in which the industrial machinery of defense had outpaced the industrial machinery of offense, in which the cost of advancing 100 yards was routinely measured in thousands of lives. The generals understood on some level that they were spending men. They used that language. Haig's diary entries during the Battle of the Somme reflect a man performing a calculation, weighing the expenditure of his available reserves against the potential strategic gain of breakthrough. The men in those calculations were units of military capital. Their deaths were line items. The diary entries have been described by some historians as evidence of callousness. They might equally be described as evidence of a system that had produced a form of dissociation in those who operated it, a professional requirement to think about human death in terms that prevented it from registering as human death. The enlisted men had a different relationship with the same information. They knew how many men from their battalion had gone over the top that morning. They could count who came back. They did not receive reports. They received the direct experience of absence, of the spaces in the trench where men had been standing an hour before, of the noise from no man's land that gradually diminished over the course of the day as the men who had been wounded and could not get back, and could not move, and were too far from the wire to be retrieved, died in the craters and the flattened grass. In the summer of 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, the British Army began using a new weapon. The tank appeared at Flers-Courcelette on September 15, 1916. It was supposed to break the stalemate. It did not break the stalemate. The machines broke down, got stuck in shell craters, outran their infantry support, were destroyed by artillery. Some of them worked, some small gains were made. The battle continued until November. The tank is often presented as one of the great innovations of the war, a precursor to the mechanized warfare of the Second World War, an example of British technological ingenuity. What it actually was at the Somme was a demonstration that introducing new machinery into the existing system of industrial killing did not change the fundamental dynamic of that system. The defense adapted. The offense adapted. Men continued to die at rates that were impossible to comprehend. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was among the coldest on record in northern France and Belgium. The conditions in the trenches during that winter were described in letters and diaries in terms that repeatedly use the words impossible and unimaginable, words that are not figures of speech in this context, but attempts to communicate a reality that the writer knows cannot be communicated. Cold that kills. Cold that turns the feet of men who have been standing in wet trenches into masses of damaged tissue that require amputation. Trench foot. The army issued instructions about how to prevent it. The instructions required dry socks and regular foot inspections and raised duckboards and drainage. The trenches had none of these things reliably. Men lost their feet. The army continued to issue the instructions. The French army mutinied in 1917. This is a fact that was suppressed during the war and for many years afterward. It was not a mutiny in the sense of men seizing weapons and turning them on their officers. It was a collective refusal, spreading through a significant portion of the French army after the failure of the Nivelle offensive to participate in further suicidal attacks. The men who mutinied were not refusing to fight. They were refusing to be sent forward without adequate preparation into positions that offered no possibility of success. They were demanding that the attacks stop until there was some rational basis to expect them to succeed. The French military leadership responded with a combination of courts-martial, executions, concessions, and the quiet removal of the general who had promised a breakthrough. The mutinies were suppressed. Pétain replaced Nivelle. The attacks were made somewhat less suicidal. The mutiny was kept out of the newspapers. The German High Command, whose intelligence was generally good, received fragmentary reports of unrest in the French army, but did not fully understand what was happening, and missed the opportunity that the mutiny might have provided. The executions that followed the mutinies are estimated at between 40 and 70 men. The records are incomplete. The French government sealed the relevant archives for decades. When some of those archives were opened in the late 20th century, researchers found evidence that the process by which men were selected for execution was neither systematic nor clearly just. Men were shot, in some cases, as examples. The choice of who would be shot was made partly by lot, partly by the identification of supposed ringleaders, partly by the need to produce a deterrent effect quickly enough to restore order before the Germans noticed what was happening. The British soldiers who learned about the mutinies, those who learned about them at all, understood them as confirmation of what they had been experiencing on their own side of the line, not an expression of cowardice, a rational response to an irrational situation, an attempt by men who had been used as instruments of industrial killing to establish, through collective action, that they were not instruments. The attempt failed in the sense that the war continued. It succeeded in the sense that it forced a temporary change in tactics. The change was temporary because the system that produced suicidal attacks was not itself changed. The pressures that produced Nivelle and the Chemin des Dames were the same pressures that had produced the Somme and Loos and all the other failures. Those pressures were strategic and political, and rooted in the logic of a war that neither side could afford to lose and neither side could find a way to win. The soldiers knew that they were being spent. They had no language for it that was permitted in official discourse, so they developed their own. Black humor permeated the trenches with an intensity that officers sometimes found disturbing and sometimes found necessary to overlook. Songs that changed the lyrics of recruitment anthems to describe the actual experience of the front. Slang that referred to death and injury with a casualness that was not callousness but a coping mechanism. A way of making the unbearable familiar enough to bear. The letters and diaries of ordinary soldiers from the Western Front, when they have been collected and published, reveal a population of young men who understood, with great clarity, exactly what was being done to them, and by whom and why, and who continued to function anyway, not always from loyalty to country or to the cause, but from loyalty to the specific men around them, to the small social unit of the section or the platoon, to the understanding that in a situation where nothing could be controlled, the one thing that could be chosen was how you behaved toward the men you were responsible for. That loyalty was real and it was profound, and the machinery of the war used it. The army understood that unit cohesion was the primary driver of combat effectiveness, and it worked to create and maintain that cohesion through the organization of PALS battalions, through policies that kept men from the same town and the same factory and the same street together, through an entire apparatus of regimental identity. The PALS battalions were destroyed on the Somme. Villages in northern England lost a generation of young men in a single morning because those young men had been organized into units that went over the top together and were cut down together. The civic grief produced by those losses was real and was enormous and could not be contained. The names of the dead were carved into war memorials in every village, every town, every city. Those memorials still stand. Many of them list more names from the First World War than from the Second, which is a fact that communicates something about the relative cost of the two wars that statistics alone do not. Poison gas reached its most systematic deployment at Passchendaele in 1917. a campaign that has come to stand in British cultural memory as the ultimate example of the war's waste. Passchendaele, officially the Third Battle of Ypres, was fought between July and November of 1917 in conditions of extraordinary difficulty. The preliminary bombardment, which was supposed to destroy the German positions and drain the waterlogged ground, instead destroyed the drainage system of the Flemish plain and turned the entire battlefield into a swamp. The official history of the battle records the terrain as problematic. Soldiers who survived it described it in different terms. Men drowned in shell craters, not metaphorically. They sank into the mud and could not get out. There are documented cases of men calling for help from positions where they were trapped by mud, unable to move, slowly sinking, and of their comrades being unable to reach them. There are documented cases of men being ordered to leave behind comrades who were sinking because the attempt to rescue them would result in additional men being lost. The mud became, in the accounts of survivors, a presence with its own character. Not passive matter, but an active force that consumed men. The British casualties at Passchendaele are estimated at approximately 250,000. German casualties were of a similar order. The village of Passchendaele was captured in November 1917. It had been reduced entirely to rubble by the time it was taken. The ground on which it had stood was indistinguishable from the ground around it. The gain was measured in miles. The loss was measured in hundreds of thousands of men. Haig's dispatch after the campaign described it as a significant success. The criteria for significance were not the ones that the men who had fought there would have recognized. The German spring offensives of 1918 broke through the Allied lines in ways that demonstrated that the stalemate was not inevitable, that under certain conditions offensive action could succeed, that the war was not inherently static. The offensives used new tactics developed by German commanders, including Ludendorff, that emphasized speed and infiltration rather than the mass frontal assault. The stormtroops who led the offensives bypassed strong points rather than attacking them directly, exploited gaps in the line, created chaos in the Allied rear before reserves could respond. For a period of weeks in the spring and early summer of 1918, it appeared possible that Germany might win the war. The Allied lines were forced back further than they had moved in years. Panic spread through the rear areas. The British commander, Sir Douglas Haig, issued his famous backs-to-the-wall order, which is remembered as a statement of resolve, but which was, in its original context, an admission that the situation was desperate. The offensives eventually ran out of momentum. The German army had exhausted its best troops and used up material that could not be replaced. The Allied counter-offensives that followed in the 100 Days campaign drove the German army steadily back. The war ended on November 11, 1918. The armistice that ended the fighting on the Western Front did not end the dying. The influenza pandemic, which had been spreading through the army since the spring of 1918, continued killing in the months that followed the armistice. The pandemic killed, worldwide, more people than the war itself. It moved from the overcrowded barracks and hospitals and transport ships of the military world into the civilian population, and it moved at a speed that health authorities were not equipped to manage. The soldiers returning from the front carried it with them. The men who came back were not the men who had left. This is a cliché that is also a precise clinical description. The psychological literature on the survivors of World War I, much of which was produced decades after the event as surviving men aged and the war receded into the past while its effects remained present in their bodies and their minds, describes a population that had been fundamentally altered by exposure to sustained industrial violence. The terminology changed over the decades. Shell shock became neurasthenia, became combat fatigue, became post-traumatic stress disorder. The underlying reality that the terminology was attempting to describe did not change. Men who appeared functional in the 1920s and 30s, who held jobs, who raised families, who participated in the social life of their communities, carried the war with them in ways that were invisible to people who had not been there. They did not speak about it. The silence was not embarrassment exactly. It was something closer to an understanding that the experience could not be communicated, that the attempt to communicate it would fail, and that the failure would diminish something that should not be diminished. Better not to try. Better to carry it alone. The children of those men grew up with fathers who would not speak about the war, wives who had watched their husbands return as strangers and who learned, over years of cohabitation, the shapes of the damage without ever having the damage explained. The war entered the domestic life of an entire generation of European families as an absence, as a set of behaviors that could not be discussed, as rooms that were never opened. Some men talked eventually, in old age, when the original reasons for silence had dissolved into the past and the distance from the events was great enough to allow a different kind of telling. The accounts that emerged from those late conversations were different in character from the official histories and different from the literary accounts produced in the 1920s and 30s. They were not dramatic. They were not heroic. They were precise in the way that very old memories sometimes become precise, stripped of the elaboration that fresh memory retains, reduced to specific images and specific moments that had survived everything else. A man who had served at the Somme, and who spoke about it for the first time in his 80s, described one image. He had been carrying water up to the line, and he had come around a corner of the communication trench, and found, lying across the duckboards, a man from his section who had been killed by a sniper earlier that day. The body had not been moved because no one had time. He had had to step over the body to continue carrying the water to the men who needed it. He stepped over it. He continued walking. He delivered the water. He came back the same way and stepped over the body again. That was the image he carried for 60 years without speaking of it. Not the largest horror, not the worst day. One ordinary moment from an ordinary day in an extraordinary machine. The peace settlements of 1919 are inseparable from the war that preceded them, and the catastrophe of the Second War that followed them is inseparable from the settlements. The men who negotiated the Treaty of Versailles were not ignorant men. Some of them understood the dangers of the terms they were imposing. Keynes wrote the economic analysis that predicted the consequences. The consequences arrived on schedule, but the settlements are not the war, and the war is what this is about. And what the war was, is something that continued to resist being fully understood or fully described for as long as anyone who participated in it was alive to resist the reduction. The Menin Gate was completed in 1927 and bears, as noted, the names of 54,000 soldiers with no known grave. At its inauguration, the Australian General Plumer said to the crowd that one of the most touching things he had seen in all his years of soldiering was the way in which the mother country and her children had borne the toll of their dead in that dreadful war. He spoke to a crowd that included the mothers who had borne that toll. He spoke in the language that the war had trained him to use. Every night since 1928, except for the period of German occupation in the Second World War, the last post has been played at the Menin Gate at 8 in the evening. The ceremony is brief and formal. It does not explain anything. It does not attempt to explain anything. It repeats itself, night after night, an acknowledgement of a weight that cannot be lifted. The men whose names are not on that gate, because there was something left of them to bury, rest in cemeteries across northern France and Belgium that are maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. The commission was established in 1917 during the war because it was already apparent that the scale of death required organization. There are over 2,000 Commonwealth cemeteries on the Western Front. Some are large, some are small. The headstones are standardized in design because the commission decided early that differentiation by rank or wealth was inappropriate. Officers and enlisted men were buried under the same headstone. This was, in its context, a radical democratic gesture. The commission still maintains those cemeteries. The grass is cut. The headstones are upright. It is a very orderly record of a very disorganized dying. In 1914, the people of Europe did not know what was coming. The analogy most available to them was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, which had been brief and had produced a decisive outcome within months. Many of the men who enlisted in the summer of 1914 expected to be home by Christmas. The phrase "it will be over by Christmas" became, in retrospect, one of the great ironies of the century. But it was not a foolish expectation at the time. It was a reasonable extrapolation from recent experience. The men who made it did not know that the Industrial Revolution had changed warfare in ways that made all previous experience irrelevant. The Industrial Revolution had changed the productive capacity of nations to an extent that made wars of attrition possible in a way they had never been before. It had changed the destructive capacity of weapons to an extent that made defense systematically advantageous over offense. It had created railway systems that allowed the rapid movement of reserves to any threatened point, negating the advantage that a successful attack might otherwise create. It had created a global market that allowed belligerent nations to sustain themselves economically for far longer than had previously been possible. All of these changes together meant that a war between industrialized European powers would not end quickly and would not end decisively, but would grind on until one side ran out of the particular combination of men and material and will that kept the machinery running. That grinding is what happened. 4 years and 3 months of grinding at a cost that was not fully tallied until after the shooting stopped, and even then was disputed and revised for decades. The minimum estimate of military deaths in World War I is around 10 million. Civilian deaths, from violence, from disease, from starvation, caused by the blockade and the disruption of agriculture, adds several million more. The numbers are so large that they have become a kind of shorthand for scale rather than a meaningful enumeration of actual people. Each of those numbers was once a person. Each of those persons had a face and a name and a particular way of walking and a smell and a set of preferences in food and music and some specific texture of daily life that was entirely particular to them and that has been entirely lost. The aggregate is the only thing that survives. The individual has been wasted. The war produced, as a secondary effect, a systematic transformation of how European societies understood the relationship between the state and the individual. Before 1914, the idea that a government could compel a man to serve in the army was controversial in most democracies. The conscription debates in Britain in 1915 and 1916 were genuinely contentious. Conscientious objectors were imprisoned and in some cases subjected to treatment that amounted to torture. The argument that the state had an absolute claim on the bodies of its male citizens was not universally accepted. By the time the war ended, that argument had been normalized. The mass conscription of civilian men into industrial armies had become the accepted practice of modern warfare, and it remained the accepted practice for the rest of the century. The draft, universal military service, these terms entered the permanent vocabulary of the nation-state, products of a war that demonstrated that the machinery of industrial killing required the total mobilization of the population to sustain. The men who came home from that war voted in elections in which some of the men who had sent them into the trenches continued to stand for office. In Britain, Lloyd George, who had been one of the primary architects of the war effort, won the 1918 election in a landslide. The coupon election, as it was called, returned the coalition government with an enormous majority. The men who had survived the trenches voted for the politicians who had managed the system that had destroyed them, or did not vote, or had already died of their wounds before the election was held. The accommodation that those survivors made with the world they returned to was not simple. The disillusionment that historians identify in the 1920s and 30s, the cynicism about institutions and about political authority, the attraction of extreme political movements that promised to replace the failed order with something new. These were not separate from the war experience, but products of it. The war had demonstrated that the existing order was capable of producing catastrophe on an industrial scale and continuing to function regardless. The lesson some men took from that demonstration was that the order needed to be destroyed and replaced. The century's subsequent catastrophes are not unrelated to that conclusion. The poets who wrote about the war during and immediately after it were read by a small audience at first. Owen's work was not widely known until years after his death. 1 week before the armistice, on November 4, 1918, Sassoon survived and continued to write and became a recognizable figure in British literary culture. carrying the war with him through every decade of his life. The poets became canonical partly because they could express what the official documents could not and would not say, and partly because their expressions were aesthetic enough to be contained within the tradition of English literature rather than constituting a political challenge. The poetry is beautiful in some cases. It is beautiful in the way that things which record unbearable things can be beautiful, which is to say that the beauty is a function of craft applied to material that resists it, that the gap between the language and the thing it describes creates a kind of charge that the reader can feel without fully understanding it. The thing the poetry describes was not beautiful. It was systematic. It was organized. It was maintained by bureaucracies and supply chains and command structures and pension systems and censorship regimes and postal services and legal frameworks. It killed people, and it processed the fact of their killing, and it continued. The British Army trained approximately 5 million men during the course of the war. It killed approximately 720,000 of them. It wounded approximately 1.5 million more. The men who were not killed and not significantly wounded were returned to civilian life at the end of the war, and they returned to a world that had been changed by the same forces that had produced the war, and that did not have, and has never developed, a satisfactory way of accounting for what was done in it, why it was done, or whether the doing of it was in any meaningful sense necessary. The file on World War I remains open. The bodies have not finished being found. Every year, in the fields of France and Belgium, the plows of farmers and the earth movers of construction projects turn up metal and bone. Unexploded ordnance is recovered and disposed of in quantities that require a dedicated professional operation in Belgium, where the team that handles it is called the Dixmude Bomb Disposal Service and processes thousands of shells and grenades every year, a century after the guns fell silent. The ground is still giving back what was put into it. It will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. The technical term for the unexploded shells that continue to surface is the iron harvest, and it has not ended.